Magic and Mystery in Tibet by Alexandra David-Neel, Chapter 5, continued. Another monk whom I had known had sought an anchorite teacher for reasons that had nothing to do with philosophic or mystic pursuits. If I relate his case, it is because it contrasts with that of Yeshe's and shows another aspect of the Tibetan mind. Karma Dorji was born low. As a little boy, in the monastery where he was a Geyok, G-E-Y-O-K, and there's a footnote here that says, this is a young novice of poor parentage whose family cannot maintain him, and who does menial work at a lama's house for his living. He had been the butt of ridicule and contempt of the young novices of his age who belonged to a higher social class. These vocations had embittered his young mind, and he confessed to me that he was but a little over his 10th year when he had sworn that he would rise above those who humiliated him. When he was grown up, his companions had at last to refrain from too open manifestations of their scorn, but they revealed it clearly enough by their silence and their aloofness. Karma Dorji was proud and possessed a strong will. He still dreamed of keeping the oath taken in his early youth. His low birth and his monastic condition left him only one way of reaching his aim. He must become a famous Naljorpa, a magician, one of those who coerce the demons and make them their retainers. In this way he could revenge himself on his tormentors and make them tremble before him. In this not very pious frame of mind, Karma Dorji applied to the head of the monastery for a 2 years' leave, being desirous, he said, to retire to the forest for meditation. Permission, he knew, is never refused to such requests. Karma climbed high up on the hills, found a convenient place near a spring, built a hut there with branches and mud, immediately in order to imitate the Reskyangapas, Reskyangpas, and there's a footnote here that says the Naljorpas who have acquired the power of developing Tumo, T-U-M-O, the internal heat, and wear but a single cotton dress. A Reskyang, R-E-S-K-Y-A-N-G, or even remain naked. Okay, so let me start the sentence again. Immediately, in order to imitate the Reskyangpas, he discarded all clothes and let his hair grow. Those who brought him supplies of food at long intervals found him seated cross-legged and naked even in the heart of winter, apparently sunk in a deep trance. People began to talk about him, but he was still far from the fame that he desired. He realized that his hermitage in the forest and his nakedness were not sufficient to obtain it for him. So he went down to his monastery and this time asked permission to leave the country in search of a spiritual teacher. No one endeavored to detain him. Karma's peregrinations were much more fertile in incidents than those of Yeshe's, for the latter at least knew where he was going and under which lama he wished to practice the mystic life, while Karma had no idea of either, tramped at random. After a time, he did not succeed in discovering a magician whom he thought was capable of leading him to the topmost heights of the secret lore. He resolved to seek one by an occult process. Karma was a staunch believer in gods and demons. He knew by heart the story of Milarepa, who with their help had caused a house to fall down on his enemies, and remembered many other tales of terrible deities who brought the bloody heads which he had claimed into the middle of the Kijokor, which is a magic diagram constructed by the magician. I'll spell that word for you. K-Y-I-L Khor. He had acquired himself a certain knowledge regarding Kjilkors, so he drew one with stones in a narrow gorge and began his conjurations in hopes that the mighty wrathful lords Toas would direct him to one of the masters whom they served. In the course of the 7th night, a mountain stream that flowed in a gorge suddenly rose with startling rapidity. An enormous quantity of water, probably due to the breaking of a natural dam or to a cloudburst higher up in the hill, suddenly swept across the defile, and the young monk was swept away with his Kjilkor and his small luggage. Whirled along amongst the rocks, Karma was lucky enough to escape being drowned and came aground at the end of the gorge in an immense valley. When day broke, he saw at a distance a ritog, R-I-T-O-D with 2 dots over the O, which in brackets here says hermitage, a hermitage that stood sheltered by a rocky wall on the spur of the mountain range. The sun rose bright as it does on the tableland of Central Asia, and the little whitewashed house appeared rosy and luminous under its first touch. Karma could clearly discern the rays of light that flashed from it and rested on his head. Certainly his long-sought-for master lived there. The help of the deities answering his summons was not to be doubted. He had intended to walk up the gorge and to cross the mountain range, but they had brought him down to the ritog. The intervention had manifested itself in a somewhat rough way, Karma admitted, but he ascribed this to a cause that could not but flatter his vanity. The Toos, he thought, had not been able to resist the strength of my conjuration, but foreseeing what a powerful magician I shall become after I have received proper teaching, felt angered at the idea of eventually becoming my slaves. Rejoicing in his glorious future, Karma did not give a thought to the loss of the provisions and the clothes that had been carried away by the flood, and as he had stripped himself of all garments to resemble Heruka, Heruka, when officiating before his Kjilkor, he now confidently marched towards the hermitage in his state of nature. As he neared it, a disciple of the anchorite came down to fetch water at a stream. The trappa almost let fall the bucket he carried when he caught sight of this strange apparition. Tibetan climate greatly differs from that of India, and if unclad ascetics or pseudo-ascetics are legion in the latter country, it is not so on the heights of the land of snows. There are only a few Naljorpas who adopt that simple fashion, and as they live far away from all tracks in the recesses of wild mountains, one has few opportunities of catching a glimpse of them. "Who lives in that ritog?" inquired Karma. "My master, the Gashas." Yes, answered the trappa. Now I'm going to spell this name for you, Tobsgyais. Now I'm going to call him Tob, okay, because I can't pronounce that whole name. All right, so he says, "My master, the Gishas," Tob answered. The aspirant magician did not put a second question. What information did he now require? He knew all that he needed to know. The deities had led him to his very Sawai Lama, Tsawai. And there's a footnote here that says spiritual guide. Tell the Lama that the Kashjongs have brought him a disciple, said the naked traveler. Quite bewildered, the water carrier reported the words to the hermit, who commanded him to show him the strange visitor. Lama Tob was a well-read man, the grandson of the Chinese official and of his Tibetan wife. According to Karma's account, he appears to have been a gentle agnostic who had perhaps adopted a hermit's life by the desire to study without being disturbed by troublesome people and by an aristocratic taste for solitude. This is rather frequent in Tibet. In fact, Karma really knew very little about his guru. As we shall learn by his own story, he did not see that much of him, and the few particulars he could tell me about his parentage and the character he had learned from two disciples of the Lama who were inmates of the retort. In situation, Kushag Tob hermitage followed the rules set down in Buddhist scriptures. Quote, not too near the village, not too far from a village. End quote. From his small window, the anchorite saw a wide, uninhabited valley. While crossing the hill on which his dwelling was built was a hamlet at a distance of half a day's march. The hermitage was furnished with an aesthetic simplicity, but a large library and some beautiful scrolls of paintings on the walls showed that the hermit was neither poor nor ignorant of art. As Karma Dorji, a tall, athletic fellow, clad only in his long, plaited hair, stood before the thin, refined scholar who has described to me, they must have formed a curious picture. After having prostrated himself with the utmost fervor before the Lama, he once more announced himself as a disciple, brought by the deities to the very feet of the Master. The Lama allowed him to relate the story of the Kyilkhor, Kylkhor, the miraculous flood, and so on without interruption. Then, as Karma once more repeated that he had been brought to his feet, Kushag Tob remarked simply that the place where the water had carried him was rather far from them. Then he inquired the reason for wearing no clothes. When Karma, full of his own importance, had mentioned Kuruka, and the 2 years which he had spent naked in the forest, the hermit looked at him silently for a while, and then, calling one of his attendants, he said calmly, take that poor man into the kitchen, that he may sit near the fire and drink some very hot tea. Find him also an old fur robe and give it to him. He has been shivering for 2 years. And with these words, he bid him leave. Karma put on the shabby pagtsa, which is a sheepskin, Pagtsa, with pleasure. The flaming fire, the generously buttered hot tea refreshed him agreeably after his nocturnal bath, yet his physical comfort was diminished by the mortification of his pride. The Lama, he thought, had not welcomed him as he ought to have welcomed a disciple brought to him miraculously. However, he intended, after having satisfied his hunger and taken a little rest, to make the Gomchen understand who he was and what he expected from a teacher. But Kushag Tob did not give him the opportunity of further explanations. He seemed to even have entirely forgotten his presence in the retort, though no doubt he had given instructions about him, for the 2 disciples continued to feed him well, and the very same place next the fire was always put at his disposal. Days and weeks went, and Karma grew impatient. The kitchen, however comfortable it was, now seemed to him a prison. He wanted to work. He wanted to go out and fetch water or fuel, but the Lama's disciples did not allow him to leave the hermitage. The Lama's orders were positive. He had to eat and warm himself That was all his duty. Karma felt more and more ashamed of being treated like a pet animal that is not expected to do anything in return for its food. At the beginning of his stay, he had repeatedly asked his companions to remind the Lama that he expected an audience, but the latter had always declined to take any message, saying that they would not dare trouble their Lama and that when Rinpoche wanted to see him, he would send for him. After a time, Karma gave up asking useless questions. His only comfort was to watch for the Lama's appearance on a small balcony where he sometimes sat, or to listen when, at long intervals, he explained a philosophical treatise to his disciples or to an occasional visitor. Beside these rare gleams, the empty hours dragged on, while he revolved the various circumstances which had led him where he was again and again in his mind. A little more than 1 year passed in this way, and Karma became a prey to despair. He would gladly have borne the most cruel ordeals the Lama could have devised, but this complete forgetfulness amazed him. Though during the first and only interview with the hermit he had carefully avoided telling him anything regarding his low birth, he now suspected that the latter, through his supernormal powers, had discovered it. Thus he explained the way in which he had been treated. Possibly the master despised him, did not consider him worthy to be taught, and fed him only out of pity. Every day this idea took firmer footing in his mind and cruelly tortured the proud Karma. Still convinced that a miracle had brought him to the Lama Tab and that no other guru existed for him in the world, he did not think of undertaking a new journey to find another master, but the thought of committing suicide sometimes came into his mind. Tibetans believe that in order to progress on the mystic path, one must meet one's true Sawai Lama, Tsawai Lama, that is to say, the spiritual teacher of whom one has already been the disciple during previous lives, or if this cannot be contrived, the Lama of whom one has been the loving relative, supporter, or faithful servant. The tie formed in this way is that of the past deeds in quotes, as Tibetans call it. Karma was sinking in despondency when a nephew of the anchorite arrived. The visitor was a Lama Tulka, the head of a monastery, and traveled with a large retinue. Clad in shining robes of yellow brocade, wearing a gilt glittering hat shaped like a pagoda, the Lama and his attendants stopped in the plain at the foot of the hermitage. Beautiful tents were pitched, and after having refreshed himself with tea that the hermit had sent in an enormous silver teapot, the Tulku went up to his uncle's dwelling. During the following days, the Tulku noticed the strange figure of Karma, with his ragged sheepskin robe and his hair, which reached to the floor. He asked him why he was always seated next to the fire, doing nothing. The aspirant magician took time by the forelock. He had at last found favor with the deities. There could be no doubt that they had aroused this interest in the Tulku's mind. He introduced himself with all his titles and told about the long retreat naked in the forest, the conjuration and the Kajora, Kylkhor, in the gorge, the flood, the rays of light which, springing from the hermitage, rested on his head. He ended by relating the forgetfulness of Kushag Tob and entreating the Tulka to plead on his behalf. From the account which I have heard, it appears probable that the Lama to whom Karma now told his story was of the same stamp as his uncle. He did not appear to have been the least moved by pity and merely inquired about the kind of teaching which the interlocutor craved from the hermit. The question gladdened Karma. Now he had found someone who would speak to him about the matter he had so much at heart. He boldly declared that he wished to acquire magic powers, such as that of flying in the air, of causing the earth to quake, but he prudently avoided confessing why he wanted to work such powers. The tulku, Karma realized later on, was only amused by his childish ambitions, but he promised to convey his request to Kushag Tob. Then, during the 2 weeks of his visit, he did not even look in the young man's direction again. The day came when the tulku took leave of his uncle, and Karma looked sadly at the Trapa's attendants at the foot of the hill, who were holding by the bridle the richly caparisoned horses ready to start. The man, whom he had considered as a heaven-sent protector, was to depart without having obtained any answer to his request. Most likely, Kushab Tob had not granted it. Despair again overwhelmed him. The tulku passed the hermitage's door, and Karma was about to salute him with the usual triple bowing down, when the latter gave this laconic order: "Follow me." Karma Dorji felt rather astonished. He had never been asked to do any service. What could the Lama want? When he reached the foot of the hill, the tulku turned towards him. "I conveyed to the Kushag Rinpoche your desire of acquiring the various magic powers which you mentioned," he said. Rinpoche's reply was that he had not got the books which you must study for this retard. A full collection of them exists in the library of my monastery, so Rinpoche has desired me to take you there in order that you may begin work. Here's a horse for you. You will travel with my trapas. Then he left Karma and he joined the small group of dignitaries of his Gampa who had accompanied him on his journey. All turned towards the hermitage, respectfully bowed their farewell to the invisible anchorite, vaulted into the saddle, and started at full trot. Karma remained motionless, lost in amazement. A trapa gave him a push and put the bridle on his horse in his hand. He found himself on the back of the beast, trotting fast, with the Lama's attendants, before he had realized what had happened. The 4th day after his arrival at the Gampa, a trapa informed Karma that according to the tulku's order, the collection of books mentioned by Kushag Tob had been carried into a tsangkhang. Tshamkhang. He could begin his study at once. Food would be sent regularly to him from the monastery. Karma followed his guide and was led up a hill to a tiny, pleasantly situated, whitewashed house. From the window he could look down on the monastery with its gilded roofs, and beyond it, a valley enclosed by woody slopes. Inside the cell, next to a small altar, 30 big potis, P-O-T-I-S, which are volumes, 30 big volumes, carefully wrapped in their robes and tied between carved boards, were placed on several shelves. A wave of joyful pride swept across Karma's mind, and at last one had begun to treat him with proper respect. The trapa informed him that the tulka did not wish for him to remain in strict seclusion. He was at liberty to live as he liked, to fetch his water at the stream nearby, to walk outside whenever and wherever he wanted. He was left alone, and Karma buried himself in his books. He learned by heart the large number of magic formulas, which built scores of kyurkas, Kyilkhors, using more tsampa and butter to make the tormas than for his meals. He also practiced the many various meditations described in the treatises. For about 18 months, his zeal did not slacken. He went out to fetch water, did not speak a single word to the Trappas who twice a month brought him his food and fuel supply, and never so much as glanced through the window at the world outside. Then slowly thoughts that had never occurred to him crept into his mind during his meditations. Certain words of the books, certain figures of the mystic diagrams appeared to him as pregnant with significations formerly unsuspected. He often stood long in front of his window, watching the monks going in and out of the monastery. Finally, he walked across the hills, examining the plants and the pebbles, looking attentively at the clouds traveling in the sky, observing the ever-flowing water of the stream and the play of the lights and shadows. He also spent hours watching the villages scattered in the valleys below, the peasants working in the fields, the animals passing loaded on the roads, and those who roamed free across the pasture grounds. Every evening, after lighting the altar lamp, Karma Dorji sat in meditation, but he gave up trying to follow the practices taught in the books. Late in the night, and sometimes till dawn, he remained sunk in a trance, dead to all sensations, to all cogitations, seeing himself as on a shore, watching the slowly mounting tide of a white, luminous ocean ready to submerge him. Several months elapsed, and then one day, or one night, he did not know which, Karma Dorji felt that his body was being lifted from the cushion on which he was seated. Without changing his usual cross-legged attitude of meditation, he passed through the door and floated in the air, traveled a long time. At last he arrived at his country, in his monastery. It was morning. The monks were coming out of the assembly hall. He recognized a number of them, officials, tulkus, certain of his old mates. They appeared tired, painfully preoccupied, with dull, joyless faces and heavy gait. Karma examined them with curiosity. How puny and insignificant they seemed from the height where he now stood. How astonished, how awestruck they would have been when in a moment he would appear to them enthroned in mid-air, and how those who treated the low-born monk with contempt would prostrate themselves trembling before the triumphant Dubtob, D-U-B-T-O-B, the magician who baffled the apparent laws of nature. Then, as he dwelt on those ideas of victory, scorn awakened in the inmost depth of his mind, and his elation subsided. He smiled in derision at the meanness of a revenge on such paltry puppets. Did they not interest him any longer? His thoughts went out to the bliss of watching the flowing tide of the strange, rippleless, white, luminous ocean. No, he would not show himself to the monks. That Karma Dorji, who had suffered in the monastery, was as contemptible as those who had wickedly humiliated him. He rejected them altogether. Thus thinking, he started to leave the place, and then suddenly the monastery buildings were shaking and cracked. The neighboring mountains pitched and tossed in confusion. Their summits tumbled on each other, while new ones arose. The sun crossed the sky like a thunderbolt and fell on the earth. Another sun sprung up, piercing the heavens, and the rhythm of the phantasmagoria went on with increasing speed till Karma discerned nothing but a kind of furious torrent, whose foaming waves were made of all beings and things of the world. Visions of this kind are not very rare among Tibetan mystics. They must not be mistaken for dreams. The visionary is not asleep. Often, in spite of his imaginary peregrinations, the sensations he experiences and the scenery he perceives, he remains quite clearly conscious of his actual surroundings and of his own personality. Often also, when going into trance, where they are able to be interrupted, they quite consciously hope that none come by or speak to them or trouble them, in any manner, though they may be themselves incapable of speaking or moving. They hear and they understand what's going on all around them, but they do not feel connected with any material objects. All their interest is being absorbed in the events and sensations of the trance. If that state of trance is abruptly broken by any exterior agent, or if he who experienced it has to break himself by a strong effort, the shock that ensues is particularly particularly painful and leaves a prolonged feeling of discomfort. It is to avoid these unpleasant effects and the consequences which they may have on his general health for those who suffer them that rules have been devised for coming out of a period of ecstatic meditation, or even ordinary meditation, if it lasts for any length of time. As an instance, one is advised to turn the head slowly from one side to another, to massage the forehead and the crown of the head, to stretch the arms while clasping the hands behind the back and bending the body backward. There are numbers of similar exercises, and each one may choose whichever suits him best. The followers of the Zen sect in Japan, who meditate together in a common hall, appoint a kind of superintendent who is skilled in detecting when a monk is overcome by fatigue. He refreshes the fainting and revives their energy by striking them on one shoulder with a heavy stick. Those who have experienced it agree that the ensuing sensation is a most pleasant relaxation of the nerves. When he returns to his strange journey, Karma Dorji found himself seated in his usual place in the cell. He curiously inspected the objects around him. His small room with the books on the shelves, the altar, the hearth, was the same as he had seen in the days before. Nothing had changed during the years that he had lived in the Chamskang, Thamskang. He got up and he looked through the window. The monastery, the valley, the woods wore their usual appearance. Nothing had changed. Yet everything was different. Karma calmly lighted the fire, and when the wood burned brightly, he cut his long hair and he threw it into the flames. Then he made tea. He drank and ate without haste, put some provisions in a bag, and went out, carefully closing the door behind him. In the monastery, he walked straight up to the Tolka's mansion, and meeting a servant in the courtyard, he told him to inform his master that he was leaving and to convey him his gratitude for his kind hospitality. Then he left the Gampa. He was already gone some way when he heard somebody calling him. One of the young monks belonging to the Tolka household ran after him. "Kushag Rinpoche wishes to see you," he said. Karma Dorji returned with him. "You leave us?" asked the Lama politely. "Where are you going to?" "To bow down at the feet of my guru and thank him," answered Karma. The Tulku remained silent for a while, and then he said sadly, "My worshipful uncle is gone beyond sorrow 6 months ago." And then there's a footnote, and it says, a reverential expression to say that a Lama is dead. Karma Dorji did not utter a single word. "If you wish to go to his ritag," continued the Lama, "I will give you a horse. It shall be my parting gift. You will find one of Kushag Tob's disciples living in the hermitage." Karma thanked his host, but accepted nothing. A few days later, he again beheld the white little house from which he had seen the light springing and coming towards him. He entered the Lama's small private room, where he had been admitted once, remained long prostrated before the seat of the departed anchorite, and spent the night in meditation. In the morning, he took his leave of his master's successor. The latter handed him a monastic toga that had belonged to the late hermit. Before he died, Kushag Tob had expressly commanded that it should be given to him when he came out of his Chams Kang. For that time on, Karma Dorji led the life of an itinerant ascetic, somewhat like that of the famous Milarespa, whom he deeply venerated. When I happened to meet him, he was already old, but he did not appear to be thinking of settling anywhere. Few are the anchorites or other Naljorpas whose novitiate has proved so strange as that of Karma. It is because it is indeed quite peculiar that I have ventured to give such a long account of it. Nevertheless, the spiritual training of a disciple always includes a number of curious incidents, many strange descriptions which I have heard, and my own experiences as a disciple on the heights of the land of snows incline me to believe that most of them are perfectly authentic. And that concludes Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is entitled Psychic Sports. And I just like to apologize for my stumblings over these Tibetan words. For me, they're very hard to pronounce, and I hope it doesn't interrupt your understanding of what I'm reading. And I hope you're enjoying it. And please like and subscribe. Until soon.